We're so excited to have you all here for a chance to discuss Roosevelt's recent report, A Progressive Take on Permitting Reform, Principles and Policies to Unleash a Faster, More Equitable Green Transition. In the wake of a historic package of legislation that will bring trillions of dollars to build out the clean energy economy, progressives have been in an extensive debate about what it will take to quickly turn these dollars into the infrastructure we need. Our new report enters that debate with a principles-driven policy toolkit. We argue that moving efficiently does not require us to abandon democratic practices and offer concrete proposals for how to marry these two important priorities. We're excited to host a conversation today that will give the authors an opportunity to share their work. More, we are thrilled to welcome new voices to reflect with the authors on how their work can inform state policies and executive action. To truly move with the speed required by the climate crisis, we need states to act alongside Congress, and we need the president to act where Congress cannot or will not. Our conversation today will reflect on how to ensure that we can meet the demands of the moment. We at Roosevelt have been thrilled to collaborate with the Climate and Community Project on this work. Our moderator, Rihanna Gunright, will introduce them more, but I wanted to say a thank you to them and to all our panelists as we get started. And I also want to say a special thank you to Chris Carlson and Michelle Wilczynski for their work on this paper and event. And now it's my privilege to introduce Rihanna Gunright, Roosevelt's Climate Policy Director. Rihanna leads Roosevelt's research at the intersection of climate policy, public investment, racial equity, and public power. Prior to joining Roosevelt, Rihanna was the policy director for New Consensus, charged with developing and promoting the Green New Deal, as well as the policy director for Abdul El-Sayed's 2018 Michigan gubernatorial campaign. As the permitting reform debate has moved to the front and center of ongoing discussions about the green transition, Rihanna has been steadfast in her commitment to making sure that our work to address the climate crisis moves forward by bringing a wide range of diverse and expert voices to the table. In March, we held an incredible day-long conference where activists, organizers, academics, and policymakers came together to discuss these themes, which inspired this paper. This paper and our conversation today continue that discussion that was begun there. So I will hand it over to Rihanna and then to our panelists.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really thrilled that you're here. So today we're going to be discussing two things: our new paper, A Progressive Take on Permitting Reform, and in the second half of the webinar, how we can continue to press forward a progressive vision for permitting reform that balances and takes seriously the speed at which we need to deploy renewables and the need to ensure democratic and community participation. How do we press that vision forward seriously at the legislative level, federally, at the state level, and through executive action, particularly as the legislative prospects for permitting reform remain uncertain? We have a lot to cover today, and I'm truly the least interesting part of it. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into introducing our incredible panelists. So I'm going to start off with the authors of the report, Johanna Bozuwa and Dustin Mulvaney. Johanna is the executive director of the Climate and Community Project. Her research focuses on extraction and fossil fuels, energy justice and democracy, and the political economy of transitions. Dustin is a professor in the Environmental Studies Department at San Jose State University and a member of the Climate and Community Project. His research focuses on the social and environmental dimensions of commodity chains and production systems, particularly on emerging technologies and environmental change. And then our panelists in the second half of the webinar are Howard Crystal and Sonal Jessel. Howard oversees the energy justice programs at the Center for Biological Diversity. He oversees the energy justice programs litigation, promoting a clean energy transition, including fighting against both utility obstacles to distributed energy and centralized control of energy resources. He has spent his career in private and public interest practice, litigating environmental and wildlife protection, public health, safe energy, and open government cases. Sonal is the director of policy at WEAC for Environmental Justice. There, she leads the New York policy team and is responsible for advancing the organization's policy agenda at the state, local, state, and national levels, in addition to leading the Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan. Sonal works with local city and state leaders to advance policy changes that improve environmental health and advances a just transition. She's also appointed to the New York State Climate Justice Working Group. And prior to joining WEAC, she conducted research in energy insecurity, housing, and public health at Columbia University. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass it to Johanna and Dustin, who will share some of the key findings and takeaways from the report.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rihanna. Very excited to dig into this topic with this whole crew. I'm going to, everyone will bear with me, share my screen and make sure that we can get this started. All right. Can folks see that all right? Amazing. Great. Amazing. So as both Suzanne and Rihanna mentioned, this report that we did is a progressive take on permitting reform, and it is just that. It's trying to provide an analysis of energy permitting in particular and the discussions that are happening in the United States today. And what are the real levers that we can be pulling, be it permitting or something else entirely, to accelerate the speed at which we are deploying renewable energy in the United States. So let's see, there we go. So why are we talking about permitting right now? What has catalyzed this discussion? Suzanne talked about this at the outset, but the biggest reason is speed. It's the fact that we had the Inflation Reduction Act passed, and now many people are rightly worried about the implementation. After years of pushing for climate investments, do we make sure that poles get in the ground, that wind is up and running? This is a huge and a big task that we have at hand. And this has really brought around some of the advocacy around permitting, largely focused at the federal level on the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. The idea around policy reform has really been, around permitting reform has been that there's an arduous permitting process that takes time and energy to do things like environmental review, when everything could be getting in the ground a lot quicker if we went faster and didn't have to do as much associated with that. So in this moment where the Inflation Reduction Act has passed, we're seeing coalitions gather together to advocate for permitting reform. And the interesting thing to note is that it's both, has renewable energy advocates that are a part of it, but also fossil fuel companies that have said, yes, we are also looking for permitting reform. And in particular, Senator Manchin has been one of the biggest proponents for this type of permitting reform and for some of the rollbacks associated with NEPA in a call for critical energy infrastructure to be built to facilitate energy security. And in fact, he made that a precondition for his vote on the Inflation Reduction Act. And just more recently this year, that part of that vision by Manchin was passed in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So we have big players that are talking about permitting, which has necessitated us as progressives to think, what do we conceptualize permitting reform to do? Is it doing what it is being proposed to do, which is accelerate the transition? And there is a real need for speed in this moment, but it's important to step back and consider what are the levers that are at our disposal to do that acceleration, especially when we have some of the funds in hand. And so this is where this paper comes in, where we're arguing that much of the federal permitting reform discussions are really mechanisms of deregulation of energy production that may in fact actually help fossil fuel infrastructure get online, but and at the same time may not be the most useful tool for getting renewable energy online because of other stops along the way. So, we understand why cutting red tape around NEPA in particular at the federal level can be alluring. It's the one quick fix to accelerate the energy transition. But I'm afraid that is basically like trying to use a hammer incessantly on one program, when the reality is that we need a multi-tool to fix the renewable energy build out. So I'm going to hand to my colleague, Dustin, who's going to walk us through a little bit of what it actually means to when people in particular are talking about this concept of permitting reform.
Thanks, Johanna. Yeah, so the first thing you notice when you look and dig into this topic of permitting reform is it's really not all about permits. There are all these other layers of things like, for example, National Environmental Policy Act analysis isn't really a permit, it's a disclosure and reporting document. You also see often when people are talking about permitting reform, what they're actually referring to are things related to like local and state zoning permits and approvals. So for example, if a project is being proposed someplace and the county has a certain designation for that particular area, you have to go back and amend the general plan for the county and things like that. That has nothing to do with the National Environmental Policy Act. There are also this one's even more puzzling in some ways, the contracts and agreements between private organizations. So for example, if you've been following the renewable energy build out questions that we're facing, the interconnection challenges that we face, where all these renewable energy developers want to connect to existing transmission lines. Those are private contracts between organizations that, again, are not related to even zoning or the National Environmental Policy Act. They're not even permits, yet they're still called permitting reform. So that's, again, we're trying to untangle this lack of clarity on what people are talking about. There are also operating and construction permits. So here's where we see some permits. So for example, if you're running a refinery, you might need an air emissions operating permit. If you have a discharge into water, or if you affect things that might put things into fill materials into water and things like that, you might be required to get a Section 404 permit. That, by the way, is not National Environmental Policy Act. That's the Clean Water Act. So these are all different areas where we're jumbled. That's been jumbled together in the permitting reform debate. And what we really need to do is bring clarity to these questions, because without having clarity to these questions, we just have this muddled conversation that gets us really nowhere. Next slide. Furthermore, when we're talking about all those different layers of approvals and analysis and permits and zoning questions, there are different domains that we're talking about. So we have electricity transmission and distribution infrastructure. Very different than the issues faced by developing a mine for critical energy minerals. So having these different types of infrastructures in the same conversation isn't very helpful either. We really need to have targeted reforms across all those different layers if we want to build out renewable energy faster. Without that lack of clarity, we're really jumbling things together. Thinking about distributed energy resources, they need permits too. They're not National Environmental Policy Act disclosures, and they're not any permits related to any environmental laws. They're like electrical inspection permits and things like that, or building permits. So having a very focused conversation across these different domains, I think, will help, again, bring more clarity about what we actually need to do to remove these obstacles to build faster and more equitably. Next slide. And this is just a typology. I won't walk through this, but of what a typical project goes through in terms of like when they identify what project they want to build, they submit their intention to build the project, and they have to go through a couple of those different layers that we were talking about earlier, getting zoning approvals maybe, or certainly going through the National Environmental Policy Act. I'll point out one thing here is often you see reports that say how long it takes to do an environmental impact statement, and they give you some quantified numbers, and usually they're just measuring that notice intent until it's built. And there are so many things that can disrupt a project in the meantime, including things like market conditions for like the price of a mineral might stop the development of a mine. It has nothing to do with NEPA. Their investors don't want them to build the project anymore. So those kinds of things will really slow down projects. But again, they're not related to NEPA, and that's why those studies that try to do these quantified assessments of how long it takes to get the NEPA process done are actually just looking at really bad data. Next slide. So just one case study. We have 4 case studies actually across the 4 different domains that are illustrations of what you could do. This is the case we'll talk about right now, the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, something I've been following since its initiation actually in 2008. And this is a process that they went through. They streamlined the approval of solar farms in what they identified as solar energy zones, these low conflict zones. And we're seeing projects get permitted in 8 or 9 months now. That's pretty quick for the development of solar farms. Most importantly, since this has been put in place across California, there has been no litigation on these topics. We don't see lawsuits. California, by the way, has a lot of solar built. I think we crossed 16 gigawatts generation of utility scale the other day, and then throw in the other 13 gigawatts of utilities. So we got a lot of solar out there. And this Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan is seen as a model for how to get community buy-in, get NGOs involved from the start so that you don't have those problems, because it's actually helpful to have more information early on and avoid conflicts. And that's how we get things built faster. You plan, you think about what the conflicts are, you get community buy-in, and then things start rolling really, really well if you have a well-designed plan. Next slide. And this is just an illustration of what a solar energy zone looks like. This is the Riverside East Solar Energy Zone. These are, again, not perfect, California desert, but this is an excellent model for building projects faster. So I'll hand it back to Johanna now.
It would be useful if I unmuted myself in order to talk. Thank you so much, Dustin. So thank you for running us through kind of what are some of those juggernauts along the way. I think, a thing that comes up really for me is the fact that it isn't always NEPA that's the thing that's slowing it down. It can be financing. It can be, the transmission interconnection components. There are so many of these other pieces that are often left out of the permitting discussion. And so when we were thinking about okay, so if we are trying to accelerate the transition and do that in a way that's grounded in the climate crisis and communities, what are the principles that we should move by? And so we came up with 3 key ones. One, we wanted to align all of our actions with 1.5 degrees with the Paris Climate Accord, and make sure that what we're doing is not, saying we'll take some bad with the good, but actually make sure we're building the good so much more. Second is make environmental laws stronger. The reality is that our environmental laws in the United States could in fact be stronger to stop things like fossil fuels from being built out, and also to reckon with the realities that the climate crisis is changing our landscape. The relationship between infrastructure, the built environment, and our lands are going to, be different now when we have fires, when we have droughts, that we actually need to be thinking about when it comes to the deployment of renewable and clean energy. And third is design with communities in mind. Dustin really hit this, I think, where there's hesitation sometimes when it comes to these concepts of community review, seeing it as maybe not, it'll slow things down, but the reality, and often what you find, is having early engagement with communities around projects can actually lower the number of issues that you could have on the long term. So policies to initiate the green transition. What are they? I'm going to run through these really quickly and talk about what we see as some of the maybe changes to permitting as we see it that would be useful, and also things that aren't permitting but actually will be crucial in the transition. The first thing we say is enable more coordination and planning. So right now we don't have as much long-range land use planning as we need to, and that could be crucial in us being able to do what Dustin just showed us, right? Look at an entire region and determine where is the safest zone for us to put this renewable energy. The second thing is that we want to be increasing transparency and accountability. I'm going to add this to the slide afterwards around interconnection. This is interconnecting renewable energy with the transmission grid. And often this creates, because it is not transparent, because the way that it's the pricing works, we actually see a massive amount of speculation that's happening of clean energy group developers putting in projects that they don't have as much intention in completing. So it's creating really jammed up situations. Then we also say that we need to increase material efficiency and do distributed energy resources, because those are ways to actually not have to build some big stuff while also making sure that we can meet the energy needs of the community. And then last is to update the 1872 mining law, which is a part of the critical mineral and transition mineral discussion, where we have a absolutely unplanned and uncoordinated transition mineral discussion. So I think that by actually updating the 1872 Mining Act, we will be in a far better position to make decisive decisions about how and why we are doing mining for the transition. And I know the Biden administration actually came out with some new opportunities there. Okay, so additionally, there's also the need to enhance community participation and consent by strengthening NEPA and making sure that we have, we are integrating community engagement so that we can actually accelerate the process. We also need to be respecting tribal sovereignty, working with Indigenous folks where in many cases there are tribal lands that big pieces of infrastructure are going through. We're going to hear from Sonal later about cumulative impact analysis, which can be another really helpful way to ensure that we are considering where we are having the most impact with infrastructure, and be able to plan and think about how we're not ensuring that no one has an overdue or undue burden on their community. And then last, provide community benefit. It turns out that it can be very useful to say, hey, we will provide you jobs, we will provide you broadband, for instance, if this is going through your community. So that communities that are local and are seeing a transmission line come through their community know that there's something that's in it for them. It's not just going to people outside. And then last, we have empower the transition. And what we mean by this is actually say no to the bad stuff and say yes to the good stuff. So one key thing that could be done is just stopping fossil fuel permitting. We can make that type of technological decision about one type of infrastructure versus another. Second, protect communities from fossil fuel pollution. Places like California have already implemented things like setbacks as a way to ensure that communities aren't as harmed by this type of infrastructure like fossil fuels. Third, set emission reduction targets. The CLCPA in New York, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act has one of the most stringent in the nation, and that's actually helping to make sure that those decarbonization targets are met. And so I think that is really some key components that we saw in the report, and as we wrote it, that would actually accelerate the transition and might get us actually further than some of the discussions when we're too focused on NEPA itself. And with that, I think I'll hand it back over to Rihanna so that we can kick off into some really important discussion with Howard and Sonal.
Thank you so much, Johanna and Dustin. Again, the full report is available on both the Roosevelt website and the Climate and Community Project websites. So we encourage you to read those because there's so much detail that we are just not able to get into today. But we want to turn to talk to Howard and Sonal about the political reality. So we did have the recent debt ceiling deal pass, and now the legislative future of permitting reform, particularly around transmission, is more uncertain. We're not sure when or how Congress will move those priorities. But we still have to move forward renewable energy development. And so we need to think about the long term, about what are the other levers, particularly at the state and federal agency level, that we can use in order to deploy renewables more quickly and sort of expand our vision of what permitting reform can and should entail. And so Howard and Sonal have been thinking about these things in their own work, Howard at the level of federal agencies and Sonal at the state level in New York in particular. So we just want to have a discussion with them about these questions. And so to both of you, Howard and Sonal, like Johanna and Dustin discussed, permitting reform has come to refer to like a whole basket of stuff, including environmental reviews, permits, approvals, private contracts. All of these things happen at multiple levels of government. But like they said, a lot of the conversation so far has been focused really on NEPA reform and federal law and legislation. And so just curious about, what is the conversation about permitting reform like in the areas that you focus on, and how are folks thinking about permitting? What are the changes there? And also, if you can let us know a little bit about how the conversation about permitting reform has sort of shaped or is shaping what's going on in federal agencies and in states when it comes to renewable energy development. So Howard, can you talk about it we'll go to you first here about federal agencies.
Thanks, Johanna, and thanks for inviting me to join this important conversation. So yeah, I'll talk about the transmission line bottlenecks, which have been a big part of what gets discussed in this debate, particularly the progressive discussion about how can we expedite transmission lines. There is a lot going on at federal agencies, and I'll just highlight a couple things real quick. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and the Department of Energy, DOE, are doing a whole bunch on transmission now. They have an enormous existing authority to act right now without any new legislation to move quickly on transmission line bottlenecks. And they certainly don't need to be waiting for any kind of reform legislation to pass to use the authorities that they have. FERC, for example, they've been working to update their transmission regulations for a couple of years already. That agency just issued new rules for the interconnection process, and it's still working on broader regulations on overall transmission planning. There's a huge opportunity for FERC to use its existing authority to address obstacles for transmission, and also to ensure we build fast and in the right places. So over at the Department of Energy, they're working on this huge transmission planning study. Unfortunately, it's really overdue. The studies are due every 3 years, and we haven't had a final one since 2015, but it's in the works. DOE recently issued a new proposal to help centralize and coordinate the environmental review process for new transmission. And it's also been spending infrastructure money to help improve the planning process. So if DOE gets this right, if FERC gets this right, we can make a lot of progress right now in terms of planning and execution for transmission lines and for renewable energy projects. And we don't need new legislation for that. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Howard. And I was wondering, in terms of FERC, are there any changes in particular that we should be looking out for, like when it comes to independent transmission monitoring, or utilities having first right of refusal?
Sure. Yes. So as I mentioned, in the transmission planning process that's going on right now, there have been a lot of proposals. FERC's got a lot of issues before it. As you mentioned, one of the proposals that we think is really important is for FERC to incorporate into transmission planning something called independent transmission monitors, who would be people who are not aligned with the utilities, who run the transmission process now, and of course have their own interests in the process and in making a profit, et cetera. And so we'd like to see those kind of transmission monitors be responsible for the planning. They can also, and this has been suggested by many, that those monitors would also play a real important role in making sure we're maximizing non-wires alternatives and things like grid enhancing technologies, so that we're building the transmission lines we actually need. And they, of course, can also play a role in making sure that we have robust, community input and minimal impacts. And then one other thing I'll mention is of course, the regional transmission organizations, which play a huge role in transmission planning now, and they're very opaque. There are a lot of advocates who spend a lot of time trying to urge FERC to use its existing authority again to bring transparency to those RTOs and improve their decision making, because a lot of the holdups are really at the RTO level.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And so, Sonal, can you talk a little bit about what's going on with permitting for energy projects in New York and how or if the national conversation about permitting reform is affecting that?
Yeah, absolutely. So New York is in a bit of a unique position because we have what was already mentioned, the CLCPA, which is the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is arguably the strongest climate bill that's been passed in a state in the United States. And this law basically requires New York State to reduce emissions 85%. And there's some like interim targets. It says by 2040, you have to have like 100% net zero emissions, and sort of sets a lot of different kind of targets along the way. And this legislation is so important because it has a lot of environmental justice oriented or climate justice oriented provisions in it that really are a big part of the permitting decision. So there's a section in the CLCPA called Section 7.3 that basically states no actions on climate can disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. And this is a very, very critical piece of law that was passed with the CLCPA in 2019. And it's important because it basically says for how we're defining disadvantaged communities, which I won't get into detail today, but for these disadvantaged communities, any decisions made by the state or entities that are, connected to the state, like utilities, at least we believe so, that they cannot be kind of doing actions on climate that might be burdening these communities, a lot of whom are lower income communities of color that have been sort of disproportionately holding the burden of toxic facilities or other kind of energy generating facilities in their neighborhoods for generations. So this statement has sort of changed the game for New York State, where now the state is also making decisions based off of whether or not communities are being impacted when it comes to their decisions on climate. Big part of that is what new energy projects are coming to the state, and how are we also transitioning our current energy generating facilities into something different. And so the other really important aspect for New York State is that we passed the cumulative impacts law last year, which is the strongest environmental justice law that we've been able to move forward in New York State in a very long time. Just behind New Jersey, we did it. And essentially what that is saying is that in the permitting process, the state permitting process, if a facility that's undergoing an environmental review might be disproportionately burdening these same communities, that you actually have to kind of do a burden report where you're evaluating for cumulative impact, and your permit might be denied if you're sort of furthering the harm that's already done in these communities. And cumulative impact, just to kind of define it a little bit, is the idea that it's not just like one facility, one bus depot, one polluting place that's harming communities, harming neighborhoods, but it's actually the accumulation of many toxic facilities in a space, or things that are harming people's well-being that actually lead to what we see like the negative health outcomes. So, lots of studies have found that a lot of like African-American communities in particular across the United States have more toxic facilities in their neighborhoods, and that, or like even just traffic congestion is part of these studies. And that contributes to like a soup of toxic pollution, toxic air that then leads to greater health disparities and chronic illness. So this is like the cumulative impacts law and the CLCPA are the two kind of big players now in New York State when it comes to permitting. And what it's really aiming to do is protect communities that are already being burdened. So as we're building new energy generation, as we're figuring out what to do with existing facilities, that is being taken into account. And in my opinion, I think it's going to really nudge the state into having a lot more renewable energy, because it actually tends to be less toxic for communities in the first place.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sonal. So just want to go back to you, Howard. So you talked a lot about FERC, but are there other things that can be done at the executive level when it comes to speeding up the deployment of renewables? And are there any sort, for example, like executive actions that could help?
Absolutely. I mean, so much of what Johanna and Dustin talked about, and it's so important, is the planning. This can't happen just by letting private companies come in and decide where, again, to focus on this transmission question, like where the transmission should be. And there are lots of opportunities for that. So again, at DOE, they have this transmission needs study. And if they do it right, they can do something like the Desert Renewable Energy Plan that Dustin gave us an example. We need that on a national level where we actually, map out where are the best places to build transmission, get the community input early, and then have the kind of result Dustin explained, where we don't have lawsuits or litigation or community opposition because we've done the consultation at the beginning. And so I think there's a huge opportunity there. And then at the land resource agencies, BLM and the Forest Service and the Department of Interior, they also, and there's some of this going on, but I think there's a lot more, can be engaged in sort of affirmative advanced planning, not waiting for applicants to come to them, but thinking strategically and in advance about where are the best places to build that will minimize impacts, and how we can best make sure that we do the right community stakeholder engagement to avoid conflicts later.
Awesome. Thank you. And I just wanted to point out for folks who are listening and are attending, we talk a lot about moving community participation up, because despite the fact that community participation is required under NEPA, the processes right now are honestly not very functional. And they're happening sort of later in the process. If you remember that a graphic that Dustin showed where you have like intent, finance, sort of development, they're happening sort of later on in the process. And it can create a really antagonistic situation where you're sort of with communities in a stance where it's sort of decide, announce, defend. And so you end up in an antagonistic situation. And so some of the research on opposition to renewable energy, both case studies and sort of overall studies, suggest that moving that up and making it more robust and putting it at a place before financing or before project plans are more baked can lead to better outcomes and less litigation later on. So yeah, Johanna, feel free to jump in, and then we'll pass it to Sonal to talk about the way this sort of interacts with cumulative impacts and environmental review.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Rihanna, what you were describing there, where it's decide, announce, defend is like such an oppositional stance to be put in as a community, where you say like, I have absolutely no say in this thing that is going to like dramatically change the environment around me. Like that's a really big thing. Whereas like they could see themselves actually as partners in the development of a project, right? Like they could see the benefit if you bring them in early. And I know that that's been like a process that has been utilized in the past to bring communities along with projects, and also probably means we have better designed, renewable energy or clean energy when you have that type of community input. And I just wanted to, bring up again what Howard said, where it's like this idea that coordination and planning could really be the bedrock of how we are doing our renewable energy build out, because that's quite different, and it's a very different rallying cry in comparison to a framework of deregulating NEPA or deregulating, whereas it's saying that actually we need better, more effective regulation and coordination so that we can get this stuff done, especially with the reality that like land use is something we need to be thinking about when it comes to the transition, in comparison to, one fossil fuel plant that's centralized in one place and then it goes out, right? Like it's a very specific place that it's in. Whereas if you're talking about, larger scale solar, that takes up space. And so we need to think really intentionally about how that interacts with our land. And we aren't going to be able to do that if we have developers going a million different directions, somewhat speculatively, and then it ending up in all the wrong places when we have to be really efficient with how we're using our energy, especially with more high heat days. We can't have people in a position in which they don't have access to energy or electricity.
100%. And so just wanted to put that note in there and to say that one of the things actually in the debt ceiling deal is that they did move up community participation a bit in the process, which is really exciting. So wanted to pass to Sonal for you to talk a little bit more about the cumulative impacts law. So in the paper, Johanna and Dustin discuss how considering cumulative impacts can be one of the ways to try to balance the needs of community and the needs of developers when it comes to permitting, and provide in some ways more certainty to developers about what a project can and cannot do in order and still receive a permit. And just wanted to hear you talk a little bit about the cumulative impact law in New York and how it affects permitting for energy projects. You talked about this a little bit earlier, and also how sort of cumulative impacts analysis, some people have talked about it, or like cumulative impacts laws as a evolution of environmental review, and in a sense that like now the findings become more binding when it comes to action. And also if you see any sort of relationship between cumulative impacts and community participation and what that can mean about sort of the ways that communities can shape what infrastructure is in their communities while also still sort of speeding up renewable development. That was a lot. You can do
I'll try. Probably not, but I'll try. Yeah, so as I kind of like detailed a little bit before, the cumulative impacts law is a bill that was just signed into law just last year and hasn't yet come into effect. So that's my only caveat for New York. It has not yet started. The New Jersey one just finally started to actually take effect. But this law essentially says it defines a certain set of like the most toxic facilities. So it's not every permit that goes through New York State. It's really the most toxic, biggest, most polluting facilities that have historically been harmful to people's health. So for these facilities, if any applicant is going for a new permit in the state actually has to evaluate whether or not this facility may lead to some type of negative impact in a disadvantaged community. If that is possible, then this permit holder has to create what we're calling the cumulative burden report. For it, the law also explains that existing permit holders, so say you're currently a wastewater treatment facility or whatever facility we're talking about, for existing permit holders, they also have to do existing burden reports if they haven't done one in the past 10 years or so, and they have to also be, if they are having a significant sort of contribution to pollution burden in these communities, then they also have to be working with the state to figure out how to reduce those burdens and actually clean themselves up a bit, essentially, to receive their next permit. So the law is really exciting because it's specifically protecting a lot of places that are considered environmental justice communities that have the brunt of all sorts of toxic facilities, not just energy facilities, but like all sorts of toxic facilities in their neighborhoods that cumulatively are leading to all sorts of burdens. Both when it comes to burden in the New York State law, it's not only just, I've been saying pollution, it's not only just air pollution, but it's all sorts of other kind of sort of economic and social well-being is evaluated for in these burden reports. And so what's really exciting about this law is that it is actually really protective for communities that are already sort of holding a lot of the big facilities in their communities. And the attempt is to really evaluate how much more a community should have to hold if they're already holding a lot. It's also meant to ensure that the least polluting kinds of facilities are brought into communities. So theoretically, it would be easier for an offshore wind project to be sited than a peaker plant because one is way more polluting than the other in a neighborhood. And so that we hope will sort of lead to a different kind of analysis when it comes to what's getting permitted. But it doesn't include every single type of facility. It's really these big polluting ones. And then, what I won't get into with your question yet is that there's also all sorts of local zoning rules that different municipalities have across New York State, and is true of other states as well, that aren't really part of the cumulative impacts law, but are also very important in terms of helping build out more renewable energy, whether that's rooftop solar, whether that's offshore wind, whether that's, all the other kind of microgrids, whatever we're talking about. So this state law is really focusing on these big facilities. How do we really be protective to communities? And it also goes along with the CLCPA, so it really aligns in the language and makes sure that the decisions that the state is making on, addressing greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutants in New York State, that this law is also sort of enhancing that and making sure that we don't lose some of the environmental justice considerations as we do climate work. A lot of times consideration of co-pollutants falls by the wayside, and we're only thinking about carbon and methane and not all the other kind of nasty pollutants that we need to be worried about. So the legislation is very helpful in bringing that back to the forefront and saying, all the different kinds of facilities that we use are important in this sort of conversation around how are we creating a just transition for New Yorkers and then other states that kind of do a similar thing. So the exciting thing about it is that we think it will be protective, but also still has the same permitting process where communities are brought in to, evaluate and respond to projects being sited in their communities, but they may not have to be evaluating a really toxic facility anymore. And maybe they are all now evaluating whether or not they're okay with, a wind project being put right off the shore of their neighborhood, which is something that's happening in New York City right now. So that's just some examples of how it's coming into play right now.
Thank you. That was so helpful. So we're going to switch to Q&A. I have been really bad about reminding you all, but just if you don't remember, you can put your questions into the Q&A function. But we're going to jump. We've already gotten some. So the first one that I want to direct to Johanna and Dustin. The co-authors mentioned various types of infrastructure requiring strategic, unique reform approaches. What are some key differences in the policy needs for siting renewables versus transmission distribution?
Yeah, definitely. I can jump into that. So I think that there very much are different power players. There are different people and folks that we need to take into consideration. So one of the things that I think Dustin mentioned at the outset is the fact that even if we look at renewable energy, there's a real range, right? So if you look at offshore wind, all of a sudden you're handling, BOEM and the, what it means to be in federal waters. So that's going to take a very coordinated approach with BOEM and these kind of federal areas. Then you have examples of distributed renewable energy, where it absolutely has it doesn't have anything really to do with NEPA, but, often utilities are trying to shut down rooftop solar and are trying to find ways to stop people from being able to deploy that. And that actually might take a whole other, suite of actors to be engaged. It might actually be that the fight is at the Public Utilities Commission more so than at the federal level. And then when you look at transmission in particular, as we're needing to get energy from where it is created or generated to people's homes, then that's actually talking about multi-state transmission lines potentially. And so that means you're having to go between multiple different states and get different permits for those different places. And there's going to be federal implications. And I think Howard did a really great job of identifying, even right now at FERC, there's a lot of this coordination that needs to be done and thought about at that federal level. And in particular, when you come into the this kind of larger transmission infrastructure discussion and like larger utility scale, then you're engaging with something like the regional transmission operator that is a nonprofit, not public entity that's managing and coordinating a lot of how energy gets onto the grid and operates differently in a lot of different regions. For instance, the RTO called PJM that is in the mid-Atlantic operates wildly differently from if you go to Texas, and ERCOT, which is a acronym that many people I think have heard in the past few years more and more, because it's one of the most deregulated energy systems we have. So that's what we're talking about when we say that it needs to be more targeted. We live in the United States that is heavily federalized, which means that we need to be thinking about this at a very multi-scalar level.
That's really helpful, Johanna. So our next question is, can you please say more about what executive actions the Biden administration could take to accelerate the green transition in a way that's consistent with progressive principles? Everyone can weigh in on this, but Howard, do you have any lead-offs?
Sure. Well, we've talked about some of them. I was actually, maybe I'll use this as an opportunity to build on some of the great things Johanna was just saying about, we focus a lot on the utility obstacles to renewable energy, particularly at the local level. Johanna mentioned rooftop solar and gutting of net metering and interconnection delays, which developers are seeing all across the country, because utilities are generally private companies. They're trying to make a profit for their shareholders. So they have different interests in energy efficiency, distributed energy, things we desperately need and are like the lowest of low-hanging fruit for us in the clean energy transition, are things they don't make money off of. So addressing that is hugely important. And there's a tendency to think, and logically, that since those are local issues, that it should be handled on the local level. And that Johanna mentioned the state public utility commissions, where really important fights happen. But one of the things we've seen is that these companies have gotten so huge. There are now 10 basically consolidated parent companies that run most of the utility transmission and distribution across the country. That has gotten really hard for states to kind of get a handle on it. So a group of justice, environmental, and consumer groups last year asked the Federal Trade Commission to launch an investigation of the electricity sector. And I think that's an example of where there's a huge opportunity. We have kind of a new leaders at the FTC under the Biden administration who've been taking a really close look at the tech industry, as I think everyone knows. But we think that given the kind of abuses that we read about day after day about things that utilities are doing across the country in Ohio and Florida, and the list goes on, that there's a huge opportunity for the FTC to look into what they're doing and really reform it to break the logjam at the local level that the states haven't been able to address.
Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in? Oh, perfect. So the next question's a bit more focused. So focusing on local opposition to site renewable energy projects to assure environmental justice considerations are taken into account over a long term. Have you seen an idea of a continuing impact fee with guardrails to assure those fees are utilized for community enhancement? So Dustin, I think we're going to give this.
Yeah, because we have a great case study, I think, in our report that illustrates that it's not the specific term that was used there, but it's a tax on lithium extraction that's supposed to recirculate in the community. It's supposed to reinvest in the Salton Sea. It's supposed to reinvest in environmental justice communities that have been left behind in one of the poorest parts of California for decades now. And those that's going to invite geothermal and lithium development. So they're basically taking lithium out of the geothermal brines there. There are things that we're going to want to know. The communities are concerned about these projects. So the tax helps pay for the health impact assessment, coordination between environmental justice groups in the county about where things will go. So that I think is a really good example to follow. We don't know what the outcome there is yet, because this is all just starting. We're just starting to see the permits, the applications from some of these developers to do these direct lithium extraction techniques. But I think that's a really great example. It might not be duplicatable everywhere, but that is one example of how to recirculate what's being generated and the resource into the community to make sure there's benefits back. Nope, Rihanna, you're on mute, I think.
I'm muted. Sorry. Thank you, Dustin. Is there anyone else want to weigh in? That seemed like a Dustin question. Okay. So gonna move on to something that's a little more broad, actually a lot more broad. Someone asked, what are the mechanisms to hold bureaucracies accountable to permitting a quicker and more effective and collaborative transition? So this is open to all of you. I thought, Johanna, you shouldn't talk about anything you want, but I thought this might be a place to talk about public renewables.
Yeah, I can talk about, I think there are two kind of components here that I would imagine would be really important. And I want to first draw upon Jamie Gibbs Ploon, who wrote another corresponding piece of research on this issue of permitting as well. And she does a really good job of breaking down, what is necessary and like, how do we empower, in fact, some of these permitting systems to run better and be more effective. And I think something that she really puts forward is the fact that there has been just a kind of like carving out over time of the capacity of these institutions and agencies. And actually part of keeping them accountable is actually giving them the tools to do their jobs right. And so I think what that means is staffing, providing capacity, giving trainings, helping them to understand how to do effective community review and like integrate new systems. All of this can be done actually and allows for more accountability. I also think the other piece that Rihanna just brought up is a piece around building the stuff that the private industry isn't building. So there is actually an opportunity, and the United States has a long history of actually building infrastructure itself. In the past 30 years or so with neoliberalism, we have found that, the United States has backed off of like building and has mostly done contracting, especially when it comes to the energy systems in particular. But we're seeing a shift. Biden is talking about Bidenomics. Like, let's talk about what it means to strengthen our capacity to build the energy and infrastructure ourselves. And then by doing so, because the intent of developing that infrastructure, that transmission line, that piece, that solar array. The intent is for it to be in the public interest, which puts us in the driver's seat in terms of the deployment and rollout of that infrastructure, as compared to trying to coordinate multiple private actors to do the things that we need them to do to, handle the climate crisis. So I think that there's another tool that we haven't been using in the way that we could actually be using it right now when the crisis is so dire, when we need speed so badly, and when we also need to be doing reparative work when it comes to, the histories of extractivism and imperialism in the United States, where like there actually might be some reparative work we can do by public and community ownership that shares the benefit, that actually does some of, even to answer a bit of what Dustin was just talking about, to ensure that communities are receiving the benefit of the infrastructure that we're building. And I actually think that some of that could make things go much more quickly.
Well, we're about at time. I did want to add to that last question, programmatic reviews. So programmatic reviews can also be a wonderful resource to get agencies themselves to collaborate on environmental review and to think about projects in a more sort of cohesive and coordinated way. That's also in the report. So now it is 2, and we don't want to keep you all over. So thank you so much for joining us today. There were so many good questions that we weren't able to answer about building codes, mining, job quality and labor rights. And we do encourage you, you can reach out to any of our panelists on social media. You can reach out to us at Roosevelt if you want to have a continuing conversation about some of those things, and we will do our best to facilitate that. Sorry that I just gave people access to your Twitter DMs, y'all, my bad. But everyone here is lovely and wants to be involved in this sort of collaborative learning and exchange. So just a note again, the report is available on the Roosevelt website and the Climate and Community Project. We will be continuing to work on permitting going forward, and we look forward to continuing this discussion and that work in the weeks and months ahead. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and a wonderful week. And thank you for spending some of your time with us.